Hey everyone, Dr. Steve Vargo here, and welcome back to I Own a Business. Today, we're diving into a topic that's making headlines far beyond optometry, tariffs. And more specifically, how could tariffs impact your eye care practice? And while the news around tariffs continues to change, understanding the current landscape is key to staying ahead and making smart business decisions. So, to help us break this all down, I'm joined today by two experts from the Vision Council, Omar El Khatib, who is Senior Manager of Government Relations, and Rick Van Arnam, who is Regulatory Counsel. They've been on the front lines of this issue, and they're going to help us better understand what these changes mean, what to watch out for, and how to prepare. So, gentlemen, welcome.
Welcome.
Hi,
Thank you for
Steve.
having us.
Well, let's start with the basics. What are these new tariffs, and why should eye care professionals be paying attention to them right now?
Well, let's just start with the basic concept of what a tariff is. A tariff is a tax on merchandise. It's paid when goods are imported into the United States. It is paid by what we call the importer of record, who is most typically a U.S. company or U.S. individual. And again, they're typically taxes based on the value of the merchandise coming in. Um, and the government has historically set statutory duty rates that apply to certain products. Uh, we have a we have a document called the Harmonized Tariff Schedule of the United States, which has about 14,000 lines of description describing products by typically name, use, or general category. And each of those distinct categories has a unique tariff or a tariff rate. So tariffs have been around since the 1789. It was like the third or fourth act of Congress that they passed the first tariff act, and it was used for years to raise revenue for the United States. Once the 20th century rolled around, that it was not used to raise revenue anymore. But long story short, tariffs have been part of our blood now for forever. It's just recently where tariffs have really become front and center. Now, we could go back to the first President Trump term, and he brought some heightened tariffs on products that originated in China, and we call those the China 301 tariffs, and they date back to 2018, and they're still in existence today. But more recently, we've seen President Trump uh, assert new tariffs, not just on China, but on Canada and Mexico, and then more recently on every country in the world. And I'm sure it's the latter that most everyone is really focusing on, that and the China tariffs. But long story short, what we call the reciprocal tariffs are tariffs that went into effect on April 5th of this year. And those tariffs started for all countries, including China, at 10%. However, there was a annex published at the same time identifying 60 discrete countries who have been identified as engaging in some sort of unfair trade practice that has been alleged to discriminate against the United States' ability to ship merchandise into their products. And those 60 countries, actually it's 59 countries plus the European Union, which got lumped together as the EU, were all assigned their own specific countrywide rate. And those rates were radically greater than the 10% baseline that was being applied across the board. That went into effect on the 5th. The 10% baseline went into effect on the 5th. The heightened tariffs were to go into effect on April the 9th. And they did. On April the 9th, at about 12:01 that morning, these new heightened tariffs for 60 nations became applicable. About 13 hours later, the administration walked itself back from those country-specific tariff rates, basically saying these heightened tariffs are going to be paused for 90 days. And in the meantime, those 60 nations which had these heightened rates would revert back to that baseline 10% rate that all countries were getting under this reciprocal tariff approach that President Trump rolled out in April. So right now, we are in this period of pause for all these countries, with the exception of China, because China had retaliated against the United States by upping its customs duties on U.S. origin products in lockstep with what President Trump did on April 5th. So, because of that, we got involved in basically a tit for tat where we were raising our tariffs, China was matching, we would raise them again, China would match. So that got us up to 125% on Chinese origin product under this, what we call this reciprocal tariff. And that 125% is not paused. And that 125% is basically a baseline in that you need to add to it other tariffs that are applicable for goods from China, including what we call the China IEEPA tariffs from earlier this year. And IEEPA stands for the International Economic Emergency Protection Act. And that was 20%. And then the China 301 tariffs from the first Trump term, plus any like regular most favored nation tariffs that were already applied to your particular product, meaning that at a minimum, products from China as of today are at a additional tariff of 145%, plus if they also had China tariffs from the previous from the first Trump administration. So China right now, it's almost as if there's like an economic embargo based on tariffs, and it's going both ways because again, China raised their rates to 125% against U.S. origin product. All the other countries, with the exception of Mexico and Canada, which I'll just put on the side, all the other countries right now are in that pause position for 90 days. That 90 days expires on July 9. And the goal, I believe, is that during these 90 days, there will be, you know, binational negotiations to reach some agreement where country X would agree to change all or some of the um, things that it's doing that we are claiming to be being done to basically prohibit U.S. goods from going into their country. And in return, then the assumption is that there will be some give by President Trump as to tariffs going forward. Now, I don't know if, like, using Japan as an example, if Japan reaches an agreement with the United States to say allow for more rice to be exported into Japan, because right now Japan has predatory duties on foreign origin rice. I don't know if President Trump will then say, okay, for Japan, again, in this example, there will be no reciprocal duties at all, and you just go back to what we call the most favored nation rate duty. Or will the win be he will say, Japan, you get to stay at the 10% reciprocal rate that's being offered to everybody else, rather than being accelerated to the 24% rate that Japan will revert to in July if there's no agreement. So we're seeing that we're hoping that negotiations will take place, which will allow for there'll be some de-escalation on the tariff front on a country by country basis. Now, one last point here about Canada and Mexico, because they are being treated differently. Canada and Mexico were given their own special additional tariff of 25% back in, well, he first rolled it out in February. Then the president paused that for a month. And then at the end of the month, there was another pause where the president said that if your products qualify as originating in Mexico or Canada under what we call the United States Mexico Canada Free Trade Agreement, then it would not be subject to the additional 25%. But if your products that are made in Mexico and Canada don't qualify under the free trade agreement, then you'd be subject to 25%. So in a long, it's a long way of saying Canada and Mexico don't have a separate reciprocal tariff like all the other countries, and but they have their own unique specific 25% tariff. And just one last point, um, there are a number of countries which aren't on the reciprocal tariff list also. For instance, Russia's not on it, and North Korea and Cuba and Syria and Iran. And the reason they're not on it is because those countries have in the past lost what we call the most favored nation trading status and had already been given heightened duties of at least 35% on products coming from their countries. So for years, they've already had country-specific rates. So that's the environment that we're in right now. And importers who are engaged in international trade, bringing goods into the United States, are faced with having to pay these duties to get the merchandise released into the commerce of the United States and to then be able to sell it to their customers.
So with this pause position, obviously we're dealing in a time right now of a fair amount of speculation and unknowns. And I feel like I should probably mention that today, as we're recording this, it's April 17th, because by the time this goes live, things could change, or somebody listening to it after we've aired this for a while. That being said, let's bring this back into the eye care industry. And I'm really curious on your thoughts on how this will affect our target market, which is typically eye care professionals. So, based on either the current situation or what could potentially happen, what eye care products will you think will be most affected? Because this is where I see optometrists really scratching their heads going, how should we adapt or how should we prepare for this? Are we talking about frames, lenses, contact lenses, technology, all of the above?
Oh, yeah, yeah,
I,
it's all of the above.
yeah.
Go ahead, Omar. Sorry.
No, I was just gonna say it's yeah, we're talking about plastic frames, non-plastic frames, sunglasses, lens grinding equipment, all of that. So you're looking at upwards of what 150%, right? In some cases 170, I believe, in with the lens grinding equipment. So that's a culmination of the original China 301 duties, the regular duty rates that are applied to it, the IEEPA duties that Rick mentioned, and then these reciprocal tariffs. So yeah, over 150% on many of the most popular and well-known products in the industry.
And Steve, just to be clear here, these reciprocal tariffs are not just targeted on eyewear products. They are going to be applied across the board to any merchandise being imported into the United States,
Yeah.
with the exception that as blew up over this past weekend, there have been some product groups that have been carved out. Most recently, we heard about cell phones and semiconductors and pharmaceutical products. But before that, you had auto and auto parts and steel and aluminum. And the reason these are getting treated differently is because those product groups either already have a special, unique, heightened tariff associated with that product or are in the process of being investigated under what we call Section 232, which is a piece of law from the 1960s, um, or are in the process of having an announcement made that they're going to be investigated. So there is like an Annex 2, which is an annex of exclusions. And lots of folks have contacted us basically saying, what is this annex all about? How do we get on it? And I explained to them that there's no means to access it. And even being on that list doesn't mean you're going to be immune from additional tariffs. It means you're not subject to the reciprocal tariffs. But when we look at eyewear product, no eyewear product is added on that particular list because, again, that list is targeting products that are either already in trouble with additional tariffs or going to be getting their own additional tariffs very soon.
Okay. Most of the clients that we work with are business owners, and we all know how cost of goods affects the bottom line. Most ODs, especially ones who own their own business, are already familiar with price increases because we've been living in that world for well before the discussion around tariffs even started, living in a climate of inflation. How could these tariffs further affect the cost of goods? which have already gone up for owners. The cost of goods that practices order through their vendors, would we expect increases there?
Yeah, I mean, put yourself in the shoes of the vendor slash distributor slash importer, because they're the ones that are going to have to pay this increased duties. I just repeat, it's not the foreign government or the foreign exporter that's paying the customs duties. The U.S. importer is. So now if you're a distributor in the United States and you're bringing in frames or lenses or whatever optical product you're concerned about, you've got a decision to make. So can you go back to the foreign vendor and negotiate some price concessions? Maybe. Are they going to be willing to absorb all the duties and giving you a reduced price? I don't have any way of guessing whether that would be the case or not. But that's one option. The second option, of course, is the distributor slash importer slash, the reseller in the United States can look at their own business structure and decide how much of this can they absorb. And that may mean having to make hard choices regarding, their use of their working capital. And, you know, does that mean that they're going to have layoffs? Does that mean that they're going to need to put on hold plans to expand? Um, but there would be some level of belt tightening. And of course, the third option, and this is what I'm sure your listeners are most curious about, is how much of that is going to get passed on to, to the next channel, to the professionals or the optical retail shops, who then in turn will pass it on to the patient. So again, I don't know if if the professionals or um, the the optical shops are going to be willing to do the three things that I just mentioned the importer will do: try to renegotiate price, absorb some of the costs, or pass it all on. But there's going to be some degree of price ripple that's going to end up being felt by your listeners' patients when they come in to get new eyewear.
And it's possible it's all three, correct? If they were to renegotiate the prices, where some practices do have some leverage to do that, absorbing some of the cost, which doesn't excite many business owners. And then the discussion becomes, how much of this can we pass on to the patient? And I don't know, because I personally believe we live in a world now where a lot of us don't have sticker shock anymore. And maybe that's unfortunate. But as consumers, I think we're almost accustomed now to prices going up. So we'll have to see if that does get passed on to the patient. Is that something that needs to be explained to the patient, or is that just something that I think as consumers, we all have to deal with, and we almost have become a little bit numb to prices elevating.
I mean, I think if raising prices does become necessary, I think communicating that to the patients, maybe the reasons, especially the challenges posed by supply chain disruptions, can sort of help maintain trust and transparency, especially if we have relationships with those patients. So, kind of just having those discussions, gauging, the circumstances around, the atmosphere that we're currently in around tariffs can help maybe mitigate some of those concerns.
I've seen the question come up from practice owners who are rethinking where they source their optical products from. And is this something you normally see during times of tariffs? A lot of inquiries I've seen on social media specifically about sourcing from US-based companies. So does this cause a lot of businesses to sort of shift their purchasing strategy?
I'm sure folks are looking at options. I'm not sure, what those options are for buying US produced eyewear. Um, and keep in mind that the key ingredients that are necessary to produce eyewear, whether it be in China or the United States, um, are typically not produced in the United States, so that those raw materials are being imported into the United States. So there's going to be the cost of the tariff on the raw materials or the parts or the components that are being used in production here in the United States. So the US, those companies that are manufacturing in the United States will not be immune from these tariffs and the cost issues that are associated with them. I will say that we know, because again, the Vision Council represents, basically the manufacturing arm of the optical industry, that there has been for years now talk about trying to find different manufacturers outside of China, trying to have a more varied supply chain. And some companies have followed up on that and others haven't. And that helps if you're trying to avoid these really high tariffs coming out of China. But, if 90 days pass and all of a sudden um, the reciprocal tariffs escalate, then those companies that diversified into Cambodia or Vietnam or the Philippines or Thailand or Taiwan or whichever other Southeastern Asian nation are going to be facing, similar discussions. They're going to have higher tariffs, albeit not as high, not nearly as high as on China, but they'll have to walk through that three question paradigm again.
What about stocking up on products? Is this something that you typically see businesses do? There's the argument over if we just stock up now before prices go up, we'll save money. But in small business, they have to deal with cash flow as well. And sometimes the same thing happens with inventory. Too much money gets tied up in something and it limits the cash flow. Or is it just too early to say with what we're dealing with this 90-day pause? And again, I understand this is speculation. We don't know for sure, but any thoughts on practices that are asking, should we be stocking up on product now?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a little difficult to say, but you kind of hit the nail on the head there. So it might be a good time to purchase from countries who have like the current 90-day pause, right, that are reduced down to 10%. But during this time, there are negotiations happening. And so suppose you stock up on products now at that 10% rate, maybe negotiations happen during that time and maybe that goes away, or maybe you do that and then something happens and then they go back to the original reciprocal tariff rates after July 9th. So you're kind of in this position where I would just kind of maintain a good eye on the news and see what's happening, reach out to different resources that you can to kind of gauge the circumstances again and see where it's headed. But yeah, it kind of it does put people in a difficult position because you don't really know what's happening there. So there's kind of pros and cons to that. I don't know if you want to add to that, Rick, but that's where I see members currently in that situation.
Yeah, and just to add on top of that, because what Omar said is exactly correct. But let's say you decide that you want to basically front load your inventory here in the United States to benefit from the 10%. Basically, at a minimum, you would have the peace of mind of knowing that it's 10%. It's not going to fluctuate, but you got to get it here. And you need lead times to have it manufactured and then to get it here. And if to get it here within a short period of time, like a 90 days, to get it manufactured and get it shipped here, you have to say, use air freight rather than putting it on an ocean going vessel. Your freight costs are going to go up. Now, I'm not saying the freight costs will go up so much that they would, be worse than paying the tariff, but there are other business elements that will be triggered if you try to race to get stuff in. One technique that might be available for those who are considering this is to think about using what's called a bonded warehouse. And bonded warehouses, which again, there's expenses associated with them and there's paperwork issues, but it allows you to bring the goods in and put it in a warehouse and not have to pay the duties at that time. And then when you need to get it out of your warehouse, pull it out then and then pay the duties then. So there are two benefits to that. One is if at some point in the future, the duty rates go from 10 to 0, and you can wait till they go to 0, then you can pull it out at that lower 0 rate. Um, uh, but you also have to be mindful that the opposite could happen as well. It could go up, and at some point, then you're going to have to make a decision. Do you leave it in the warehouse or do you pull it out? So that's just another little strategy that those who are considering trying to front load might want to give some consideration to. And also allows you to defer payment of the duties. That's another problem with these companies. They might not have the cash to basically pay for the duties when they're coming into the country now, because now instead of paying, what had been a 10% duty on eyeglass frames at the beginning of the year, plastic eyeglass frames, and what had been a 2.5% duty on those plastic eyeglass frames back in before Trump 1.0. Now you're looking at paying 155%. So if you don't have the cash, using a deferral method of, say, like using a bonded warehouse, then you'd only have to pay the duties when you're pulling it out of the warehouse. So even if you end up paying the higher rate, you might be able to better manage your cash flow that way.
I think when people read the headlines, was it last week, that there was a pause? A lot of people took a deep breath, but something's going to happen, right? This thing is not just going to go away. For those who were following and maybe stopped following, we should expect tariffs in some form to, that's going to be something we have to prepare for.
Okay, well, I'll take a shot at that first and then let Omar, echo in. Yeah, I think for starters, those of you who are involved in the China trade or who are buying products that originate in China should not expect to see there to be a quick resolution to our dispute with China and now their dispute with us. China has a thousands of years history of basically subjugating its people and telling them what to do, basically for the good of the collective. So I think that they're more than willing to basically try to wait out the United States. I think the belief is that we are not nearly as stoic when it comes to making sacrifices. But the other countries present, I think, real opportunity for there to be some sort of negotiated outcome. And as I said earlier, I don't know what that outcome is going to eventually look like. Is it going to look like the tariffs go away entirely?
All right. Well, to pick up from where what Rick was saying, yeah, people that are looking for relief from China tariffs might have to wait a little bit longer. Not all these countries are equal in terms of how President Trump perceives them, I would say. Even today, the Italian Prime Minister was visiting the White House, and President Trump said that he believes there's going to be, 100% a deal will be made with the EU, but he believes it'll be a fair deal. So we are often seeing leaders of different countries coming to visit President Trump, open to negotiations. So it kind of depends on how he perceives that and what that looks like. But for those waiting on China, you got to remember these have been happening since the first Trump administration, his trade war with China. So it could be prolonged, but I would just look at the news, keep updated on that because as we've seen, it can change hourly at some points. There's news coming out all the time. So if you want to maintain, figuring out what's the best business strategy, I would just kind of stay up to date on that to make sure that you're up to date on what's happening with the White House in those negotiations.
A great place to end. So thank you guys so much. Very informative. Thanks for the Vision Council for all the work that you guys are doing to keep people informed. And we'll keep our eye on the news because it is changing quickly. And I know as ODs, as business owners, we'll want to keep our eye on what's going on and how we can navigate this strategically to make the best business decision. So really appreciate both of your time today. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, Steve.